Okay, guys, so thanks for joining me and welcome to TAP, otherwise known as the Alphabet Podcast. So, wherever you're listening, however you're listening, welcome. Everybody's welcome. So, for those of you that's been joining for quite a while, you'll understand that this is a podcast about the A to Z of issues that are affecting people's mental health. The aim is to become your own therapist. We've gone through quite a few difficult subjects. Now we're up to D. Depression is a big thing that's affecting a lot of people, and it's something that a lot of people are currently living with at the moment. And notice how I said that, living with at the moment. So we'll go back to that a little bit later. But depression is very common. 1 in 6 of us will have a common mental health problem, like anxiety, like depression, in their lifetime. So 1 in 6 of us. So that's a lot of people. We've looked at complicated grief. We looked at it when we got to see, along with COVID, where I explained the difference between complicated grief and depression. So I think people can make that distinction now. But I think for me as a therapist, there's a lot of misconception around depression. And I hear it a lot of the time. Depression is sadness. And sadness is a part of it, but depression is not just sadness. Depression is actually a mental illness. Going back to when I spoke on COVID about the stress containers and how we're managing our stress containers, depression is a little bit different. Just like anxiety, it affects people in different ways. So it can be mild, moderate, or severe, but it's a mental illness, which means that it can be diagnosed and there is a treatment for it. So in the UK, the treatment for depression tends to be a combination of medication and some type of talking therapy. The thing about depression is that it's often overlooked because it coexists with a lot of other mental health conditions and physical health conditions. So anxiety and depression go very well together, but also a lot of chronic health conditions. Depression is a part of it. And I can testify to that myself, having an autoimmune illness and depression being a side effect of that. So for those people that have long-term physical ailments, they may be well aware that depression is a part of it, but it also exists with a lot of other mental health. So not just anxiety, schizophrenia, emotionally unstable personality disorder. It really does get in there. Interestingly, a lot like anxiety, it affects more women than men. So there's something in that as well. For me as a therapist, I often hear as well that self-harm is often associated with depression, and it can be. So we're going to have a look at that as well. As 1 in 14 of us will self-harm in our lifetime. So I feel like this podcast on depression would be a good place to fit that in. And also, I'm going to give a trigger warning now. I will give it closer to when we get to these difficult subjects. But people with depression are 15 times, and I would suggest it may be higher than that, more likely to die by suicide. And 6,000 people die by suicide in the UK. 6,000 people, 6,000 preventable deaths. 200 of those at least are school children die by suicide each year. And it's one of the leading causes of death for 10 to 19-year-olds. I've alluded to it before, but 3 out of 4 of the suicides that take place are men. By the end of the podcast, I would like us to have a better understanding of what depression is, different types of severity, the different types of depression, but to also understand a little bit more about self-harm, because it's also going on and people are not really talking about it. And the aim of this podcast is to try to get us talking about things that are difficult. I'm also reluctantly, but I feel a responsibility, I'm going to add a little bit about suicide and just clearing up some of the myths and maybe getting a few of us more comfortable having difficult conversations with our loved ones. Because like I say, to me, 6,000 deaths are 6,000 preventable deaths. So by the end of this podcast, we want to know a bit more about depression, understand about self-harm, figure out the link between depression and suicide. But like with some of the heavy stuff that we cover on this podcast, I don't want it to just be outlining the problems. We have to come up with some solutions, what resources are available to us. So I'm going to try and make it and keep it as light as possible, but depression is something that's affecting a lot of us, and we do need to get into why so many men dying by suicide, if depression is a major factor in it. what's happening, so we can get into it. So you often hear it, people ask me a lot of the time. I've had people ask me, I've wondered myself, what causes depression? And the truth is, there's no real definitive answer about what causes depression. There's no one single cause. But if we can just look at it generally, so depression is a mental illness, so it's diagnosable. And in the UK, if you've usually had a low mood for a period of 2 weeks, a doctor, a GP may diagnose depression. I think that's a bit quick. The doctor will mark it down from then and monitor it. And then if it continues, depending on the severity, you may be prescribed medication and talking therapy. But what is depression and what does cause it? So, to give a visual, because there's a lot of things involved, I've come up with this idea of a depression hoodie and backpack. So if we can all visualize a hoodie and a backpack. So if we're looking at the hoodie, we can clearly see on the front. So if we look at depression as a hoodie, what can we see when we look at the front? So what do you see when you look at me? So a person that's depressed, you may see that they've withdrawn. You may see that they've changed their personality. You may observe things like a change in their appearance. They may appear disheveled, or the hygiene is a bit lacking. You may notice that they may look tired, and that could be because they're not sleeping enough. Or equally, if you have a loved one that's sleeping too much. The same with eating. If you have a loved one that is not eating, or is alternatively eating too much, that might be something that you pick up. With depression, there tends to be good days and bad days, so you might observe that in yourself or in your loved ones. One that's not necessarily picked up straight away, but the unexplained aches and pains. So you may see that on the outside. People may complain about having aches and pains. They may take alcohol and drugs. You may observe that. You may not, because not all drug taking and alcohol use is public. So they may do that in the privacy of their own home. So you may or may not see that. You may observe a lack of motivation, and you may observe that in yourself. So those are the things you can see. And you may see sadness. You may see sadness. But what I want to say from now is depression is not sadness. I hear that a lot. Depression is sadness. Sadness may be a part of it, but depression is not sadness. So you may observe sadness. So now we want to look at the hood area. So the head, what's going on in the head with depression, because depression is an illness that affects your emotions, your thinking, and your behavior. So what could be going on in the head? So there could be things like anxiety and poor concentration, lots of self-criticism. And that is something that's very common in depressed people. They'll think very negatively about themselves. They may lack confidence, which is another big one in depression. They may have a negative body image, which again is there with a lot of people that are depressed. They think quite negatively about themselves. There may be some feelings of sadness and guilt and shame, but I'd expect to see a lot of frequent self-criticism, a loss of confidence, self-esteem, self-blame, pessimism, so not feeling particularly positive. But less obvious things like problems with your memory, things that necessarily you might not be able to see, but it's what's going on as a mental process in a depressed person. So we've had a look at what you can see and the things that are less visible but are going on. So now we're going to have a look in the backpack. So these are the things when people actually really put forward ideas about what causes depression in people. These are the kind of things that they look at. So you have things like your genetics. Depression may seem to run in families. So then that brings into the nature v nurture, or epigenetics, which kind of bridges that gap a little bit more. So that's how your environment and your behavior can have an influence on your DNA. It's reversible, so there are things we can do about it. But things like traumatic events can trigger depression in some people. Things like discrimination, inequality. You don't have to do studies to see, but there have been studies that show that discrimination is a factor in a lot of mental health. Then you have things like abuse, and that could be like sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse, because that often gets overlooked, the emotional abuse. But if you think about what's going on in a person's head, I'm thinking a lot of the time, the emotional aspects of abuse will be the things that kind of ruminate. Then you have things like poverty, which also influence it, and finances. Breakdown of relationships. That's a big factor in triggering depression. So we look at childhood experiences. I mean, I've mentioned when we was doing attachment, how having a parent with a mental illness can become a pattern of learned behavior. So parents with mental illness, children with mental illness, there is a link. So when we look at what causes depression, it's not just one thing. So we've looked at the things you can see. We've looked at the things that are going on in the hood or the head, and we've looked in the backpack. So now if we go back to our stress containers, excuse me, if we go back to our stress containers from the last time, now if we imagine putting that hoodie with all the contents of the hood and then emptying that backpack into that stress container, you can see that all of these different aspects is going to be overloaded and it's going to be impossible to keep a lid on. And that's going to be a lot. So depending on how much you've got in your backpack, your stress container will be smaller anyway. When people ask what causes depression, take your pick. There's so much things going on. And what I want to make clear, because I've said it already and I'm going to keep saying it, depression is not sadness. There is this smiling depression that a lot of people kind of fall into. So if we look again at that hoodie and what's going on in the hood, what's going on in the front, what's in the backpack, if you imagine a face, and a face with a smile or a laughing face, that's smiling depression, where the insides don't match up with the outsides. And I think that is what a lot of people use as a coping mechanism and a defense mechanism. Humor and smiling is a good defense because a person could have all of these things going on in their stress containers, in their hoodie, in their head, in their backpack, and for the most part, cover it up with a smile. So I'm hoping that's giving people a different idea and dispelling some of the myths about depression, because for the most part, people think, yeah, I can spot a depressed person. They're just moody or sad. Not necessarily. People hide things. They put up a facade. They have this mask, and sometimes we have to look a little bit deeper. So up next, we're going to have a look a little bit about the types of depression and a bit more about the treatment for depression. So go grab yourselves a drink and I'll be back in a few. Okay, so types of depression now, guys. So when we just looked at the backpack and the hoodie, I was describing the general symptoms of depression. So you may hear people say things like, I'm a failure, I've let everyone down, it's all my fault. Just general attitude and thinking and general hopelessness. But there are different types of depression. So as well as the general depression, like if we just call it that, bipolar disorder, I'm gonna throw that in because until quite recently it was known as manic depression. And that's because people who have bipolar disorder will experience depression. So all of those symptoms that we've described with the hoodie and the backpack, but they'll also have an episode of mania. And mania looks a lot like a person being over full of energy. So I don't know if you've ever seen that. So if we look at it, they might be very talkative, find it difficult to stick to one subject, be full of loads of ideas, don't want to sleep. And a big one that I know is, especially I have a few friends that suffer from bipolar disorder. And quite recently, a friend of mine had a period of depression. And then the next thing I noticed, and she's been very open about it, she was on Facebook and she was skating and it was behavior really out of character, like really hyper kind of behavior. And another big thing in bipolar, taking loads of risks, things that are really quite out of character for that person. But another key one is spending loads of money. So this bipolar person, when they're experiencing this mania, they'll be spending loads of money. And obviously that has knock-on effects when you come back around and realize that you may have put yourself into debt and things like that. So you have the bipolar disorder, and that can also be mild, moderate, or severe. So on every level, depression does not look the same for everybody. So you have bipolar, but you also have what they call perinatal depression. And I think people used to call it postnatal depression, but perinatal just includes the time around childbirth. So it can be before or after. And there may be a lot of women who have suffered from perinatal depression, and it actually impacts more than just the mother. It has a knock-on effect on the family unit, but also on the mother and child relationship. So again, going back to attachment, when I've said a parent that's experiencing a mental illness and is not able to bond with their child, that has issues further down the line for their attachment So there's that type of depression. Another one that kind of gets overlooked, and I think it really needs to get some more research, especially in a country like Britain, is S.A.D, so the seasonal affective disorder. And I know for a fact, every year when it gets dark and the nights draw in, I become extremely miserable and extremely depressed. So there's about 2 million people that suffer from S.A.D every year. So as I'm recording now, it's quite late in the evening, but there's daylight outside and I'm grateful for that daylight. So hoping that's giving you a different kind of idea. So depression is not just one thing. There are different types of depression. And I said it in the beginning, depression often comes when you've had a long-term physical health condition. So I'd expect to see that with people that have suffered with chronic health conditions. So a GP will usually diagnose depression after 2 weeks. All right. So they're not the only people that can diagnose. Psychiatrists can also diagnose. And the treatment is usually antidepressants and talking therapy, which obviously I subscribe to. Talking therapy, great. What's not so great, I believe, is that the NHS, for the most part, use CBT as their therapy of choice. Things like CBT, which is cognitive behavioural therapy, can be very helpful with your unhelpful thoughts. But if there are further back root causes, CBT is not necessarily the best therapy to get into your past and your childhood. So all those things in your backpack. So it might help with the things that are going on in the hood, but the things that are in the backpack might not get as much attention, which is why a therapist that looks into the past a lot like myself is very useful for depression, because you'll tend to find that there are some psychological reasons. Even if there are physical ones, there are some psychological things that we can go over. And the medicine is good if you're suffering really badly, but remember, it just deals with the symptoms. It doesn't look at the root causes. So the aim is to try to recover. It's not just to keep going, it's to recover. But something quite interestingly is exercise is just as effective as medication and talking therapy for mild to moderate depression. So I asked, why is there not more exercise prescription? And me as a qualified sports scientist, I can actually say to you, this is factual. Exercise is just as effective in the management of depression. And GPs in this country, they can prescribe anything that's legal and obtainable. So you think about the costs, all of the costs to the NHS of this physical and mental health conditions. Prescribing exercise in comparison, is it that much more expensive? Is it even more expensive at all? So there's not just a medical approach to treating depression, but that tends to be what it is. And my approach to depression is you can recover from depression. You do not suffer from depression. You just may be living with it at the moment. So that's very important for people to understand. Okay, you can recover from depression. Now, I'm going to try and move this along because it has quite a few sections to get through. But workplace depression is an area that I want to look at because, like for all my podcasts, when I research and some things jump out of me and they include themselves in the podcast. So I was looking at different types of depression and workplace depression jumped out. And I saw a stat that said 56% of employees are experiencing symptoms of depression. 56%. Now, I ain't no mathematician, but that's more than half. Yeah? It gets worse. Female employees, so once again, women, 20% more likely to suffer from workplace depression. So I thought about that and I didn't have to think very long. It's the old saying, women are expected to work like they don't have children and to raise children like they don't work. That makes sense. But what was even more alarming is that only 10% of people suffering from workplace depression are currently seeking mental health support. So that might be through the employee assistance programs that Health Assured runs, and there must be others. But only 10% seeking mental health support. So I thought, what does that look like? What does that look like? And I think it's obvious to see that it's going to involve a lot of sick days for people. If people are depressed and not feeling their self and they're going through all of the things that are on the hoodie and all of the things that are in the backpack, it's going to have a knock-on effect on work. So there's going to be a lot of absenteeism, and that looks like a lot of sick days, which cost the economy millions and millions. But I don't care about the economy. I care about people. So it looks like absenteeism. So people understand that for the most part. But what people don't necessarily know so much about is the presenteeism that happens in work culture. So that's turning up, going to work sick, doing regular overtime, all of this weekend and holiday working outside of hours, and more importantly, remaining contactable. So that's either by phone or emails. You're contactable when you're not working. And before I became a therapist, I worked in a betting shop. And oh my goodness, it was a total nightmare. If you want to work in an industry where the customers definitely don't like you and the management like you even less, you can go and work in a betting shop. I'm sorry. For many, it may be a good experience, but it showed me that the way a company or an organization treats its staff has a knock-on effect for their mental health. And I think for the most part, employers could give two flying, and I'll let you finish the rest of that. They don't seem to care. So something needs to be done about this workplace culture. People that are perfectionists may struggle more with switching off. People pleasers and people that have issues with boundaries will find it more difficult to assert themselves and have that work-life balance. So it's important that people understand that depression shows up everywhere. So I spoke to a lot of people about how they feel about work and the negative environments they're in. And I asked a lot of people, do you ever use those employee assistant programs? And they're like, no, I'm not going to speak to them. They're just going to tell my employer all my business. And I remember a particular time when I was working in the betting shop and I'd had a few successive losses and I was really struggling to be present at work, but I was a manager, so I had responsibilities. I was still showing up. So that's that presenteeism stuff. I was dealing with stuff, but still showing up. And a very good colleague of mine, Lisa, I love you, she recommended me calling up the employee assistance program and speaking to them. And my response was, not a chance. Not a chance. I am not going to go and chat my business to these people for them to then go and tell my managers. But now I've educated myself a bit more around the subject, and they do not communicate with your employers unless you give them permission to do so. So the counsellors they use are BACP registered like myself, and we don't communicate with employers. We definitely don't. So it's important that people know that these things are confidential, and for the most part, they're free. There's a lot of aspects to it that are free. And if you're struggling at work, you need to have access to this. But I will ask these companies, whether they're big or small, what are you doing for staff morale? What are the incentives? And I'm not just talking about financial incentives. Nobody wants these unobtainable financial incentives that they can't reach. Our bonus at the end of the year is not going to compensate for my mental health. What are employers doing? Are you giving them gym memberships? If you've got the space, is there exercise on site? Are you employing counsellors on for a couple of hours a week just to give your staff access to these independent people? Are you giving them flexible working hours? Does anybody need to work 5 days a week? Especially when it's been shown that actually reduces productivity. So what can we do about workplace depression? Assuming we're not all going to walk out of our jobs tomorrow. So we can manage that stress containment. So that might mean prioritizing the workload. So some of the things that don't need to be in that stress container right now, you take it out. And you say no to anything extra if need be. Because why are you putting things in your stress container that don't need to be in there? Boundaries. Saying no is powerful. Because every time you say yes to someone else, you're saying no to yourself anyway, sorry. But it's true. So better boundaries. And if you struggle with that, you have to look at that. Don't skirt over that. So better self-care. And that involves being disconnected. So logged off means just that, guys. Being logged off. I cannot say it enough. Exercise. It will boost your energy levels, reduce your stress levels. All them happy hormones, the oxytocin, the serotonin, the dopamine, it will increase all of those and reduce the cortisol, which is the stress hormone. So that's the thing that's problematic. You can manage your physical health. Don't go to work when you're sick. Let them threaten you. There's laws to prevent these things. You can get sick notes. You can self-certify for the first 7 days and then get a sick note from your doctor. They can't discriminate against you for being ill as long as that's the case. Discuss with your line manager if you feel safe to do so. Look, I'm really struggling in this work environment. I'm not in a good place. Do things you enjoy outside of work. And this is a big one. Don't be afraid to make changes to your job. The world is full of new opportunities, and I think sometimes people forget that. For years and years, like I said, I was in this betting shop doing a job I hated. And due to a combination of my absenteeism and presenteeism, they actually managed me out of the company. They didn't care about the things that I was going through with my own health, the things that I was going through as a carer, caring for a loved one and their health. They didn't care. But guess what? Them managing me out of the business caused me to have a look at my life. and rethink and retrain. And I went to college to train to be a counsellor. And as they say, the rest is history. So there are things that we can do for ourselves, but employers, happy staff, happy work environment, better productivity. Why wouldn't you contribute to that? Guys, don't spend too long in a job that you hate. Life is too short. It really is. I was on training with a lot of people that worked full time and came to college one day a week and done their placement hours. You can retrain while you're in a job if security and finances is a big consideration. You just have to work harder, but it's always worth it in the end. So I'm just going to pause right there so you guys get something to drink, and I'll be back on the other side again. So far on today's podcast, guys, we've had a look at what depression is. So we've had a look at the hoodie and the backpack. We've looked at how it's affecting the nation of workers. But now I want to get a little bit more serious and a bit more tuned in. And we're going to look at children and depression, because children are very important to all of us. We all have children that we love, and they are the future. So nearly 80,000 children and young people in the UK suffer from depression. 80,000. So there's 80,000 children that have that hoodie and that backpack, carrying that around, this mental illness, all of those things in their stress containers and really struggling. So when we looked at being Black and British, we looked at the fact that children that are living in poverty are 4 times more likely to suffer from a mental health problem. So these children are going to be overrepresented in the figures. So there will be children living in poverty, a lot of Black children, a lot of white children, but a hell of a lot of Black children. Now, this is shocking. 200 school-age children every year are taking their own lives. And I would expect that to be higher, because these figures, the comprehensive figures on suicide, have not been really done properly since 2018. So expect that to be higher. And it's just really concerning, because we've got all of these little people struggling with things that are too much for adults. So some of the reasons for depression in children. So going back again, I'm a therapist that looks into the past, a family history of mood disorder. So going back to the attachment stuff, if you had a depressed parent, it could be more likely that you yourself will suffer from depression as an adult, or have periods of depression, because we're trying to get away from that term suffering. So you may live with depression. Things like loss or death, big things for adults, but even bigger things for children who don't understand all of the concepts. So they may internalize a lot of things around loss. Things like moving schools, and we're adults now, but we've all been children. And I've experienced moving schools many times, and the anxiety and some of the withdrawal that comes from that. So physical health problems again. So children are the same as adults. If they suffer from a lot of physical health problems, they may get the ensuing depression that comes with it. Now, abuse, and that could be physical, sexual, or psychological. No one type of abuse is more harmful than another. They're all harmful. Witnessing violence, so in the household, so that could be parents fighting, siblings, older siblings, traumatic events, having an unstable family environment where the adults just shout a lot, because I get a lot of children that I see in therapy, and it's deeply disturbing to a child. Some people may have seen that image of what a child sees when they see an adult shouting, and it's a very scary type of image, and that sticks with me, which is why I try. I know sometimes, guys, it's not always possible, but where possible, not to raise your voice so much with children, because these things end up in the backpack. So I cannot not talk about this, but a lot of children are suffering from poor self-image, a way that myself as a child growing up in the 80s didn't have. And we've got to look, and it's the 2 word, it's S&M, and for you adults, it's not that, but social media. I mean, look at the effect that it's having on adults who are able to have that grown perception of what's real and what's not. But what's it doing to children? Those perfect images, those perfect filtered images. But in terms of bullying, now kids don't have to leave the house to bully other children. And us as adults, do we really know what's going on these social media platforms? Why are we giving our children access to social media? The cons far outweigh the pros. I know sometimes it's easy in terms of managing your child, but we really need to get a good look on this, because 80,000 children suffering from depression, we've got to look at some of the things that are going on. So I had my friend Ez on, works with children on a day-to-day basis, but I've had a bit of experience of working with young people. During COVID, I worked for a young person's agency, and you see a lot of depression in young people, and it can look different in every child, but look out for things like a sadness or a mood that doesn't go away, maybe some trouble sleeping or sleeping more than usual, because these things like eating, sleeping, these common themes underlie our mental health. So when we're checking in with people, we need to be checking in on the eating and the sleeping, not being able to concentrate. So that may have knock-on effects at school. So once again, I'd expect this to show up not just at home, but at school as well. Not engaging with things they used to enjoy. So maybe they're video games. They don't want to play the PS5 and talk to their friends online anymore. Or they seem a bit just different. Maybe some potential self-harming behaviours. We'll look at self-harm a bit more later, but you know, we know the people and the children around us. So when we see those small little changes, that's where we need to get a bit better at honing in. So your child may struggle with confidence where that wasn't an issue for them before. They could be irritable or angry, so that might involve acting out. And I know for the most part, when parents see children acting out, the first thing that comes to mind is, I have to discipline this child. This is not happening in my house, but actually look a bit deeper. It could be that behaviour and that acting out is a sign of something more sinister. So if your child is tired and exhausted all of the time, so maybe rule out any physical causes, but once you've done that, if it's still going on, it could be that your child's suffering from depression. If they talk about feeling worthless or guilty, because sometimes it's not in what people do, but it's what they say. Are they spending more time in their room? Things like anxiety. If your child suffers from anxiety, there's a good chance they may suffer from depression. They are conditions that go very well together, anxiety and depression. One that keeps you worried about things that haven't happened, and one that keeps you transfixed on things that have. So there's an element of trying to bridge that gap. So things like mindfulness are important when you're dealing with depression. But things like headaches and stomach aches, so the physical presentations with children, and have a look at when they feel these headaches. Is it when they have to go to school? Is it when they have to see certain people? Look for clues in play. I don't know if you've ever observed a child and they've got two objects and they're bashing them together and they're fighting. That could be a sign that there's something going on. Have a look for clues in their play. A good little thing for parents to have to hand, I think anyone that works with children, or deals with children should have this feelings wheel. So it's like something that you can buy online. I'm not going to say where this time. And it just has a range of feelings and the different feelings that underlie those feelings, because it's sometimes hard for children to verbalize. So, you as the young person, what can you do to manage your own depression? So Mind has come up with a few things. You can make a playlist of your favourite songs. Do some creative activities like painting, drawing if you like, writing if you like to write. Journaling is very good at recognising your triggers, but also just capturing your emotions and helping give it somewhere to go. Get outside and go for a walk. That's a very good one. I think that most people should be doing that anyway. Are we getting outside and going for a daily walk? Being one with nature, just having a moment to have that mindfulness. Sport and exercise. Young people, it's a brilliant way to manage your mental health. Whatever your mental health is a very good way to manage your stress container, get out your aggressive impulses, everything. Plan activities with your friends. Always have something to look forward to, and that goes for the big kids too. Always have something to look forward to. If you find that things are bottling up and you're really struggling, talk to someone you trust. So that could be a friend or a family member or a teacher, but talk to someone you trust. Do some community activities, because I know since post-COVID, a lot of people are feeling quite disconnected from the world. Do something that makes you connected to your environment, like volunteer. But also know that if you're still struggling, there is help out there, and you can see a GP who can refer you to a therapist, possibly put you on medication. But there's an organisation called COO, which is an anonymous, personalised mental health organisation for children. And Young Minds is another charity that works very closely with young people and their loved ones in dealing with things like depression, but not just depression, things like eating disorders and other things that are affecting our young people. So I think it does look differently in children, and I think that's something us as adults are gradually becoming more aware of. Children are very resilient, so given the right help, their recovery can be very swift. They're very resilient. And we just want to make sure that these children grow up to be adults with not so many things in their backpack. So getting your child help is not a sign that you failed. It's actually helping your child. Your child will not be the adult that's trying to carry around all of these things in their backpack. So we're going to have a look at some of the effects that women are dealing with depression next. So once again, quite a heavy topic. I'm going to try and break it up as much as possible. I'll be back in a few. So people, the saying is ladies first. So we're going to hone in on women and depression. So I spoke about in anxiety how women were twice as likely as men to be diagnosed with anxiety. The figures look almost exactly the same for depression. Remember, anxiety and depression often coexist, but women are twice as likely to experience or at least be diagnosed with depression as men. And interestingly, a higher percentage of women also receive treatment, 15% of women compared to only 9% of men. Now, I'm a woman, so I can put through a few kind of observations or kind of deductions from those stats. And the first thing that I always go to is the different gender expectations. So I said it before, women are expected to work like they don't have children and raise children like they don't work. So this kind of dual role that women, these different hats that women have to wear in society, it makes sense that their stress containers are going to be overflowing more than men. And there are some men that do these things, but on the whole, a lot of the raising of the children is down to women, especially if single parenting. Once again, there are male single parents, but a lot of them are women, and they're still expected to work. So just think of a woman that has to work and navigate all of the different holidays. Employers tend to not be very understanding on the whole, but that's quite clear. Women, different expectations. I don't think many people will put too much argument forward for that. I'm sure some people that like to argue will, but women also experience major life events that involve hormones. So going back to the beginning, things like perinatal depression, that involves a lot of hormones. Things like PCOS, polycystic ovary syndrome, those kind of things. But you have the autoimmune conditions as well that affect hormones. Like I still suffer from Graves' disease, which is a hormonal condition. And one of the byproducts of that is depression. You have this up and down in mood. But something even more important that I'm looking around and everywhere I go these days, I don't know if it's just because I'm more aware, but I'll always see a woman, whether it be a white woman or a black woman, a woman somewhere in the scene with a fanning herself. So the menopause is one of the most underrated events that a woman goes through. And I can definitely speak from experience, and it's often not picked up because GPs have this idea that you have to be a certain age, it looks a certain way, but the menopause, that when you go through that period of menopause, ladies, you will know, but one of the things that most people are surprised about is the level of depression. It almost feels like an out-of-body experience. So there's so many women that are going through the perimenopause and the menopause and are not even aware. So the things like headaches, unexplained joint pains, like the brain fog, just totally forgetting who you are, what you are, where you're going, feeling all of these emotions all at once and not understanding why, because you're still getting periods and you're thinking it can't be that. So any woman that's currently going through these things, different changes in body temperature, the headaches, the brain fog, reach out. GPs are slowly getting that knowledge. I mean, they only have 2.5 hours of free. It's only about half a day's training on something as big as the menopause. So women are suffering because of things like that. And like I mentioned with the children, it has a knock-on effect on children because this is going to affect a woman's relationship with her children. Another interesting stat, and very alarming, but one that people probably do understand also. Women are 10 times more likely than men to have experienced extensive physical and sexual abuse during their lives. So if we go back to the backpack, there will be some men that have experienced abuse, and that will be in their backpack, but women 10 times more likely to have that in their backpack. This is also a factor in eating disorders, which will be coming up soon on the podcast. So 30% of women that have eating disorders also have a history of abuse, and it's often sexual. So there's that. So women more likely to experience sexual abuse. So all of these things that women have in their backpack that men necessarily don't have as much, definitely the hormones. There's some things that women exclusively go through, and that's just the fact. There's no man that's going to go through the menopause. There's no man that's going to give birth. So it's just being mindful that there are some things that women go through that you don't understand. And sometimes we don't understand what we're going through. So just trying to be more mindful, just to listen, even if you can't empathize because you could never go through it. Just try to imagine if all of these things was happening to you, how it would be. So we've looked at women and depression. So women twice as likely to be at least diagnosed. That's where my take on it is. But now I just want to look at how depression is affecting Black women. And I'm going to always refer back to this because I am a Black woman. So Black and Black British women are more likely to experience a common health problems such as depression than white women. So that looks like 29% of Black women compared to 21% of white women. Now, when I was looking at anxiety, I looked at some of the different presentations and how things look in Black women. And I mentioned the discrimination when we looked at being Black and British. But we're going to look a bit closer at this concept of the misogynoir. So it's just French for misogyny, which is an ingrained like prejudice or dislike of women. So, you know, when you have misogynist, that's the implication there. But the misogynoir, just by the noir at the end, which is French for Black, it's the ingrained prejudice towards and discrimination towards Black women. So it's where sexism and racism combine to create these intersections of discrimination. So going back to what I said in being Black and British, if you haven't listened to it, go back. I've tried to break down intersectionality. So these two different intersections of discrimination meet, and it is a catastrophe. It is a bomb, and it needs talking about. And I'm not so worried about the prejudice per se, because we all have prejudice. So the prejudice is the stigma, but it's the discrimination. So that's the oppression. Discrimination is the oppression part. I'm happy with anybody thinking what they like, as long as what you think doesn't negatively impact on me, because what you think about me then mashes up my shit. So that's the difference between prejudice and discrimination. And I think the oppression of Black women is so total because it's invisibility. Even now, you don't see Black female presence in the way that you should. And just to show you that it's like that, not just in Britain, but in the world. So in 2014, the hashtag Say Her Name campaign. So that's the stories of how Black women were being overlooked in the criminal justice system everywhere. Just not mentioned, just not a part of the conversation. At least Black men, on the whole, are a part of the conversation. Black women, the constant microaggressions, they're being labelled angry for having feelings. Strong, those labels of being angry, strong. And I kid you not, last week, I went to a birthday dinner for a very good friend of mine, and she'd invited maybe 10 or so other women. And on my way to the venue, I kid you not, I saw a car that had been completely damaged and a Black woman on the pavement. And it didn't take me very long to realise that she'd been hit by the car whilst on the pavement. So there's not much more serious than that. A person's been hit by a car on the pavement, they could have any number of injuries, right? Wrong. So I ended up waiting with this young lady who turned out to be a friend of my friend. We were both going to the same venue. But the response, firstly, of the ambulance and people on the phone, and then the police that attended, was actually quite alarming. It was obvious that we were Black women from when we were calling up. And I think that contributed to, because the call was put out as a priority 2. I don't know what you need to get hit by for it to be a priority 1. And I understand that the NHS has problems, but getting hit by a car, possibly having life-threatening and life-changing injuries, should be a priority 1. The police attended, and there were 3 police officers. And what I will say, they attended, saw all of these Black women, and you could genuinely see the fear. And that fear continued to rise as we got more distressed. And I will use the word distress. For my friend whose birthday it was, her friend has been hit by a car. Okay? There's going to be an element of distress. And I will tell you, she was distressed. We all were. But it was that on the phone, like, what's all that shouting? What's all that? It is that idea. It just, us being upset sometimes looks different. But you could see it in the police officers. They were so scared to even offer consolation. The most they contributed to the situation was asking the person that's been hit by a car when she can't talk. She's not screaming because thick thighs do save lives. And Sash, hope you get well, babes. But she couldn't communicate. She wasn't screaming and shouting because she was in pain. And you're spending 2-3 minutes trying to get her to spell her surname. Now, I get hit by a car. I don't give a shit what my surname is. Get me the ambulance. Get me the ambulance fast. I could be dying. And it was a really sobering experience. I just felt like we are definitely misunderstood in a lot of ways. So this misogynoir exists every day in society. I know a lot of black women that just by speaking their mind, they're worried about being perceived as aggressive, constantly just walking on eggshells. And how are black women protected? Sorry, black men, but even by you guys. So it comes back to it. Us as black women, we're going to have to do this part for ourselves. So what can be done? We can listen and validate black female experiences. So if you're someone that's not a black female, so you might be a white female, a white man, a black man, listen and validate these experiences, because these experiences that black women are describing, they're not making it up. Okay? So we need some more black women sister circles and some collective validation and support. People are not going to do it for us, girls. We're going to have to do this ourselves. We need more safe spaces for black women to be heard within their communities. So even if it's just like an organisation within every community where the needs of the black women are heard, I'm here for it. We need to challenge discrimination when we see it. So once again, even if you're not a black woman and you have a black friend and you see that she's been treated differently or judged unfairly, you can step in and say something. You can be an ally. We need to change the language around black women. Like, I don't want to hear the word strong black woman unless you're describing what I'm lifting in the gym. Okay? Because I'm allowed to be vulnerable. So you can take that shit back. Take that shit back to the shop. We don't need that. So we need to change the language, and us, ourselves, as black women, need to give that shit back. So we need more visibility. So black women who hold power, and even celebrity status, I don't believe in a hierarchy of people. So this whole cult of celebrity goes over my head sometimes. What are you famous for? If it's for being a leader in your profession or something, then I can subscribe to that. But, shaking your booty on TV and being famous for that, girl, do what you need to do. But at least come back to your community and help someone else to maybe shake the booty too. Because what we need to do is come back a bit more and give back to our community when we get to a certain level. And I feel like that doesn't happen. We need to inspire young black girls with positive black female role models. But this is where it gets a little bit negative, and I'll try to do it as gently as possible. But I believe that within the black community, and definitely within black women, there's a lot of competition as opposed to collaboration. And I'm big on female solidarity, women of all races. I'm a strong believer in women should stick together. But I see a lot in the black community, it's almost like a competition. I'm happy for you to do well, but I don't want you to do better than me. I'm happy to help, but not if my help will get you somewhere. So it's this whole competition v collaboration. And I call it crabs in a barrel mentality. We're constantly pulling each other down when we should be lifting each other up as black women. I try to get a lot of female therapists of colour, black and otherwise, to come on this podcast and contribute, because I felt like we suffer disproportionately with mental health, and this kind of project is bigger than me. The amount of reluctance, it's that reluctance to collaborate, to do something that's bigger than you, where we're falling short, black women. And also the gatekeeping, so just being the enemy of progress. And I see that throughout our community. You have the ability to help someone. You may have the links that you could give someone at no cost to you that would help them, but you choose not to do it. Now, I make a point of helping people. Some of the people I help have no care for me other than to be helped. If you look at it one way, you could say to use, but we all use somebody or something at some point. So I don't take it as negative, and I don't even take it as disrespectful when people make it clear that's all my use is. But if I can help someone, I will. So why are we not helping people if we can? We need all the help that we can get. The outside community is not going to do this part for us. This part has to come from within. So are we looking at ourselves? Are we hating on people for doing well instead of celebrating them for doing well? It's those mentalities that will keep you in a space. Your stress container will be overflowing. You'll be getting sleepless nights and you're not eating properly. Look at the community and look at what you can possibly do to help somebody, and go out and try it. Just help someone for the sake of it and see how that feels, because we need help. We all need help sometimes. So it's about being available to help. So next week, I'm going to come back and we're going to have a look at how depression is affecting our men alongside self-harm and suicide.